Hey everyone, I'm Ian Scott Cohen, your host and personal growth coach. Welcome to the Growth Coach podcast, where each episode I share actionable strategies and insights from positive psychology, self-improvement, and performance coaching to help you overcome setbacks, set ambitious goals, and really just think and feel like the best version of yourself. My goal with each episode is to leave you feeling energized and empowered so you can get back out there and live the life you've imagined for yourself. For more growth coaching tips and strategies, follow me on Instagram at Ian Scott Cohen or visit my website, ianscottcohen.com, for more info about my coaching programs. But for now, let's sit back and dive into this episode of The Growth Coach. Okay, hey everybody. So welcome back. Today we're going to continue our series on building and breaking habits. So this is part 2 of what's going to be a 3-part series. We just finished part 1. That is already up. If you haven't listened to it already, highly recommend starting there. Also, just a quick reminder to follow the show if you like what you're hearing and you find value in what I talk about. We'd love to have you follow the show. But today we're doing part 2 of our Building and Breaking Habits series. So in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into habits themselves. So what are they actually? Like, what actually is happening that makes you do the same behaviors over and over again? How are habits formed and broken? And how can we use that knowledge to really understand and grow ourselves? Because ultimately, that's the reason we're talking about this, right? We're discussing this because we are all pursuing some kind of growth and change. We have aspirations to live a different lifestyle in order to become a different version of ourselves. And that is totally normal and totally okay. A lot of times when people think about quote unquote changing themselves, they view it in sort of a negative way, as if there's something wrong with you today. That is not how I like to frame this. It's more of, this is about your life. How do you want to lead your life? What do you want to experience? What do you want to accomplish? What do you want to think and feel more or less? And that's really what we're talking about. Change is neither good nor bad. It's really the meaning you assign to it is up to you. And it's based off your values and what you're trying to accomplish. So this is not meant to be any sort of judgment on what you're doing. It's about giving you the tools to understand what you're doing, why you do it. And then if you'd like to make changes, now you'll be equipped with the clear tactical ways to actually do it. So when we talk about changing ourselves and really about growth, habits is such a critical part of that conversation. Because habits, as we explored in the first episode, habits are the way that we embody the person that we want to be and believe ourselves to be. That new identity, like we talked about in episode 1 of this mini-series. And so just to kind of set the scene, I want to give a quick recap of episode 1 so that you have it fresh in your mind as we walk through what habits actually are, what the different parts are. And then we'll dive into the habit cycle, which is a 4-part cycle. Really simple to understand. And again, for those who are tuning in and maybe didn't catch it last time, for this episode, for this mini-series, I'm using the Atomic Habits book by James Clear as sort of an anchor text, along with a few other authors that he does well to reference and that I've also read and researched to really provide the framework here. And throughout the episode, I'm going to throw in some quotes so you can hear directly from the author and also utilize how he thinks about it in addition to the strategies that I give you. So let's start with a quick recap of what episode 1 was about around habits. So in the first part of the mini-series, we explored identity and why first addressing identity and the underlying beliefs about who you are is critical to establishing who you're trying to become when you're thinking about habits. Because when we're trying to change into something. But what Clear does such a good job of articulating, and that others have found through their research as well, is that when you just focus on the outcomes of your goals, so maybe you want to lose 5 pounds, or you want to learn to play guitar, or you want to start a new business, or become, or you want to write a book, whatever it is, when we focus on just the outputs and the outcomes here, we oftentimes will get started with something, but it won't stick, right? It won't last. Maybe you took a few guitar lessons, but you didn't stick with it. Or you started to write an outline for a book, but you never picked it up again. Or you went to the gym a few times or signed up for a new exercise class. And after that, that was sort of it. And so Episode 1 really talks about why that is, and it comes down to the fact that in order to truly achieve sustainable growth for yourself, you need to get to the fundamental level in your psyche, which is your identity, or how you perceive yourself, who you believe yourself to be. And then when you're trying to create new habits, you really want to understand who are you trying to become, because the real goal is to grow into a different version of yourself that you envision in your mind. So you shouldn't be trying to learn guitar, but instead you should be trying to become a musician. You shouldn't be trying to necessarily lose 5 pounds, but instead become someone who is physically active and healthy. And you shouldn't be trying to write a novel, but instead try to become a writer. Because identity is what drives our habits. And again, the example I gave for myself in episode 1 was I definitely am a reader. I love reading books and listening to books and all that. And so what's so critical about knowing the part of your identity or trying to make a new part of your identity is the fact that every time now that I do read a book or listen to a book, whatever it may be, I feel like I'm embodying that reader identity and I am strengthening it. And then the more you do it, the more you associate with it, the more pride you have in it. And because it becomes such a core part of your identity, then it solidifies and it no longer becomes really as much of a difficult thing to do, a habit for me, but it's one that actually I find reinforcing and get a lot of joy out of. That doesn't mean I'm not struggling with motivation at times. In episode 3, the last part of the miniseries, we're going to talk about motivation because that is sort of the last piece of this puzzle. But for now, what we're talking about is just a recap. Identity is where you want to start. So you first need to be clear on the type of person you're trying to become, because who you are depends on what you do. But what you do depends on who you believe yourself to be. Now, that seems kind of circular, but again, who you are depends on what you do. Like if you want to be a writer but you never write, then you're not a writer, obviously. But you're only going to keep writing if you get to a place where you believe you are a writer. So that's why we also in episode 1, we discussed beliefs, how they are formed and their impact on us. And they can be big beliefs like, are you a good person or not? Or are you a writer or not? They could also be beliefs that are small, like, oh, I'm not good with directions was the example I gave. So just again, to kind of complete the recap here. So in order to establish an identity, you need to have beliefs about yourself. Beliefs are formed. They're just memories combined with meaning that you give to them. So when something happens in your life, that becomes a memory. And if you give it meaning, then that can be part of something that supports a belief. So if I went to have dinner with a friend last night, if I feel like part of my identity is I'm not good with directions, and last night I got lost, then I would take that memory, that event that occurred, and I would assign it meaning, as that would be proof that I am not good with directions, and I've just reinforced that belief in myself that I'm not good with directions. So that also gives you the keys to unpacking beliefs and starting to build new ones. So instead, I could say, oh, you know what? I am a person who's good with directions. Last night, I went and picked up my friend in an area of town I've never been before, and I did not get lost. So there is evidence now that I actually am good with directions. Again, a small example, but one I think is easy to understand and illustrates well how this works, how our minds work to reinforce who we think we are. So another quick example, if you aspire to be an organized person, but you believe you're not good at keeping track of things or keeping a calendar, it's going to be hard to get organization to stick. So to make yourself believe you are an organized person, you need to start compiling memories or examples where you are organized. Again, that's your evidence. You're building a new belief. So you create new beliefs with new evidence or memories that back up the belief in yourself. And so by doing that, you're literally changing your life, right? Like that's not in some crazy romantic or dramatic way with like a soundtrack, everything, you think in movies. But changing your life is about small, subtle changes in how we think and how we view ourselves that lead to behavioral changes that lead to long-lasting changes. So again, it's about the day-to-day decisions And this is the way to actually, in a practical way, change your life and make a difference in your own reality, your own experience, day to day of how you're feeling and thinking. That's what life is. It's not these grand things, but it's really moment to moment choices. And so the question we arrive at today is, when we're trying to build and break habits, how do you actually start to change your behavior? How do habits work? And what can we do to build or break them? Are there secrets? Are there tips? Are there strategies? That's where we're here today, and that's where we're going to start. So let's get started. So to start off, let's talk about what a habit actually is and why they're important. A lot of times the word habit might even be associated with a negative connotation. You think of, a bad substance abuse habit type of thing, or maybe you eat a lot of junk food, sort of a habit like that. But habits work both ways. Really, again, if they're positive or negative, really depends on you and your values and what you're trying to accomplish. There's not a lot out there that's objectively good or bad. It's ultimately what you're trying to do. So first, I want to ground us in why habits exist and what they actually are. So habits are a form of sort of a mental shortcut, right? This is something our brain does instinctually as a way to save energy and make things easier. So in that sense, habits actually serve a really powerful and important purpose. And so to kind of hammer that home, I want to share my first quote for the episode from James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. Again, I linked to that in the show notes. Definitely check it out. It's a really fantastic read. So here's his quote about habits and their purpose. So Clear writes, quote, "Whenever you face a problem repeatedly, your brain begins to automate the process of solving it. Your habits are just a series of automatic solutions that solve the problems and stresses you face regularly." As behavioral scientist Jason Reha writes, I think I got that pronunciation right, "Habits are simply reliable solutions to recurring problems in our environment." Okay, so let me repeat that. Clear writes, "Whenever you face a problem repeatedly, your brain begins to automate the process of solving it being that problem. Your habits are just a series of automatic solutions that solve the problems and stresses you face regularly." As behavioral scientist Jason Reha writes, "Habits are simply reliable solutions to recurring problems in our environment." Okay, simple enough. So again, the more you do something, the more your brain remembers how to do it efficiently. Because ultimately, our brains are trained or really set up to make survival as effective, make us as effective at surviving as possible. And so anytime it encounters a problem, be it big or small, it will remember the approach that you tried to solve it. And if that approach worked, then it will remember it even better. Because what happens is when you complete a habit, you start getting that dopamine hit in your brain. Your neurons are sending these signals saying, wow, you solved this problem. Let's remember that for the future. And every time you solve a problem in that way, it gets reinforced by your brain. And that's why habits form. It's that reinforcement that over time your neural pathways really get carved out, sort of like grooves in a river, so to speak, that every time you trigger a certain cue, is what we're going to call it, then it can start you down this habit cycle. And again, these are mental shortcuts. Your brain forms these on purpose. The idea is that it's decreasing the amount of energy that it takes to solve the problem so that you can use that energy and your attention elsewhere. Now, before we get into the 4 parts of a habit, I want to share one other thing that Clear says I think is really, really powerful, because sometimes when we think about habits and we sort of are trying to convince ourselves to establish new ones, especially if they're ones that seem difficult, like, exercising every day, for example, we start to think of habits in a very restrictive way. We think, I got to put an hour in the gym every day. That's so much time. I don't really feel like it. I don't like to live my life in that kind of regimented way, right? Like, we think of these things as restrictions because they use up our precious time. However, that actually is upside down. And I really love the way that Clear puts this because it's really an incredibly powerful mindset shift. So what he says, here's his quote. He says that habits do not restrict freedom, they create it. Now, what does that mean? Habits do not restrict freedom, they create it. What he's getting at is the fact that when things get automated, when our brain masters a certain behavior, it actually makes it a lot easier and frees up more of your mind to do other things, right? And it makes it easy for you to embody that new person you're trying to become. So in that way, it's not restrictive. It's actually liberating in a sense because you're no longer forced to wrestle with the choices and the motivations all of the time. Instead, you're a lot freer because you kind of go on autopilot. So for me, I've developed a habit, and I'll use it as one of my examples in the episode, of going to the gym every day. And at this point, it's very automatic for me, and I have several rewards built into that. But it is freeing because it's just, I kind of go on autopilot, and I just go through it, and I feel better, I stay healthier, and I don't have to, go through 10 rounds in my head of debate about whether I should work out or not. Now it's just a part of my routine. And so I do it automatically or semi-automatically, I would say. Okay, so that's an important paradigm shift, a change in the way that you think that I really want you to try to embrace. Habits do not restrict freedom, they create it. And so that's really where the power of this stuff comes into play. Now, what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to go through the 4 stages of a habit. And I'm going to actually break after each one so that it's easier for you to come back and reference it. And then I'm also going to, at the end, I'll tell you about a cool tool that I've created that you can download and use yourself. So a habit has 4 stages. The first is the cue. So this is the trigger to start wanting something. So it's something happens that triggers your mind, it cues your mind to start having a craving or starting to really want something. So you have this cue, this trigger. Then stage 2 is a craving, that desire. This is really the feeling, the motivation behind the habit. So the cue triggers a craving, this feeling of desire. Then you have a response to that craving. It's the action that you take. Then as a result of the action, your response, you get to the reward. You satisfy that craving. So again, it goes cue, craving, response, reward. Something triggers you to start wanting something that you crave. That craving makes you take an action. That action results in a reward to ultimately satisfy that craving. And every time we get to the reward, our brains are reinforcing the habit itself. The dopamine hit also serves as a reminder that this habit delivers rewards at the end of the cycle. Sorry about that. Okay. So again, it's cue, craving, response, reward. So let me give you a few quick examples to kind of frame this, and then we'll break them apart as we go through. So for instance, checking your phone, right? So we all get calls or text messages throughout the day. Maybe you get push notifications from your email. Checking your phone is a very obvious and somewhat ubiquitous habit most of us have. So what's the cue to check your phone? One obvious one is it vibrates, right? If you have it on vibrate or if it rings, that is the cue, the trigger. And what it triggers is a craving. Now, what do you crave? And you might think that's a weird word to use in the context of looking at your phone, but in reality, you're craving, the desire here is to know what message or what other thing came through, right? So let's just assume it's the text messages. You want to know who's it from? What does it say? You crave that new information because with it comes a reward, this dopamine hit. So you've got the cue, your phone vibrates, which creates this craving. Ooh, I want to know what's being said or who reached out to me. Your response is obvious. You take out your phone, you look at it, and you read the message, and you get your reward. The reward is reading the message and seeing who it's from, which triggers a dopamine hit in your brain, and you've just completed that cycle. And so you can imagine now why it's so powerful and why even today, like so many of us you might have those phantom vibrations of your phone in your pant pocket or in your bag or whatever, because your mind is already seeking that reward. And this is, you can already see why some of these things can actually have a downside. You just get so habituated, again, the word habit is in habituated, to check your phone because you want that dopamine hit. Other examples is that here's one that I really like that's actually, you might not even think about. Turning on the lights. This is one that Clear uses in his book. So when you walk into a dark room, the cue here is it's dark. Your craving, your desire is to see, to be able to actually see what's going on in the room and do things. So your response is to look for and flick the light switch, and the reward is obvious. The room lights up, and now all of a sudden you have the pleasure of seeing. So that's another simple habit. You might not even realize that you do automatically, but it is very much a habit that our brains have been trained on. Another one could be when you get home from work and you might have a glass of wine, or maybe you smoke a little weed, because you get home, maybe you change your clothes, and that's your cue to want to feel relaxed. And so your craving is to feel relaxed and to use the thing that makes you relaxed. So in the response, you have that glass of wine or that drink, or you have a hit of weed or whatever it is. And then the reward is you get to feel a buzz, or you get to feel high and relaxed. And so there's a really important point about cravings that we'll get into when I get into that specific section, because it's about what cravings really are about. And understanding that is going to help you really take control of whatever habits you might have, and if you want to change them. One more example that we'll visit throughout the episode is putting on your seatbelt. So you might get in your car, close the door, put the key in the ignition, and that sound when you turn on the engine, you probably have an alarm that sort of beeps when your seatbelt is not on, and that beep is your cue. It's triggering you to your craving really is to not necessarily be safe, but also that's a benefit. It's really to get the alarm to stop, right? So the alarm starts, you crave turning it off, your response is to put your seatbelt on, and that turns the alarm off, which is your reward. Again, this is how you can start to see how this habit, these pieces of the habit cycle are really built into some of the most compelling products out there. And that's also why a lot of them have such a good control over their users, like ourselves, is because they've mastered a lot of this. Okay, so that's setting the scene. Again, the habit has 4 stages: cue, craving, response, reward. And now let's dive into each one briefly to really so you understand what it is and how you can think about really dialing it up or dialing it back to build or break the habits that you see. So the first part of the habit cycle that we just discussed is the cue, the trigger. So this is something that sets off the neural pathway connected to your habit, your behavior. So again, something happens and the brain fires a signal that triggers you to start wanting something, you're craving, and then you take a response and you get a reward. So oftentimes the cues, if you're trying to think about what your cues or triggers are, you can really think about them in sort of the 5 senses. They're typically either something you hear or something you see, maybe something you smell, and those can start you down cycles. I'll also say the same thing can be said for thoughts. Sometimes your thoughts can trigger certain habits. So again, let's just go through our examples. Checking your phone, the cue there might be it vibrating or the ringer going off. Turning on the lights, coming into the room and not being able to see, that can be a trigger or a cue for you to actually try to turn the lights on. Putting on your seatbelt, we said the cue is when the noise goes off in your car to tell you to put your seatbelt on, or else we're going to keep beeping. So those are very obvious cues. So because the cue is such a fairly straightforward thing, what I want to do is highlight what Clear provides. Clear provides some ways to really take advantage of the fact that we understand how these things work. And so let's say you're trying to build a habit. If you're trying to build a new habit or reinforce a habit, one thing you can do as it relates to the cue or the trigger is to make it as obvious as possible. So what does that mean? So for instance, if you are trying to use a calendar more frequently, then making it obvious means putting it front and center, making it as something you cannot miss. So for instance, in our house, my fiance and I, we have highly visible checklists on our fridge. And that is just a very easy, obvious way to remind ourselves about the things that we want to do around the house or habits we might want to continue. It's a very simple checklist. It's a magnet on the fridge. And that makes it super obvious and likely that we are going to adhere to it, or are going to at least check it and be reminded to do some of the things we want to do. So if you're trying to build a habit, you want to make that trigger really, really obvious if you can. Another one, we're trying to get more organized in our bathroom. So we just recently prioritized keeping the vanity, the place around the sink, clear. And what we've done is we wrote on the mirror in dry erase marker just a little scoreboard between me and her. And every time I come in and find some of her stuff left out on the counter, I get a point. And if she doesn't have anything out on the counter, she gets a point, and vice versa. And so, again, it's making it obvious. For us, visual cues are really, really effective. And so we try to use them as often as possible. Another way to make it obvious is, alarms. These are things that will disrupt your attention and really capture your attention. So to build a habit, making that cue super obvious is really, really important. Other things people do if you're trying to improve your exercise routine or at least start exercising more regularly, things you could do are lay out your exercise clothes the night before, or when you wake up, put your clothes on that you exercise with, or put the shoes that you wear to exercise by the door. Those little things really do matter, and they help you build a new habit. Now, if you're trying to break a habit, you do the opposite. So if you're building a habit, you want to make the cue obvious. But if you're breaking it, you want to make the cue invisible or non-existent. So an example I'll give you is myself. I've been trying to scroll my phone a lot less late in the evening. So my fiance likes to go to bed between 9 and 10. And then I usually stay up for another hour and a half or so. And aspirationally, I want to use that time either to just relax and watch a show or read a book. But lately, I've been really caught in scrolling Reddit. That's kind of one of my vices, quote unquote. And so for me, the cue there right now is my phone's out and I might finish an episode or she just goes off to bed. So I instinctively reach for my phone to scroll Reddit. So what I'm doing now is a very subtle and simple change. When she goes to bed, and I go in to say goodnight or go in to put some stuff away, I actually am putting my phone by the bed and on the charger and silent, and that'll be the last time I use my phone for the night. I've done it a couple times and it works great because it literally takes the habit out of my hands. It makes it so that I can't even look at my phone for any reason, which will inevitably lead me to start down that habit. So if you're trying to break a habit, make the cue invisible, make that trigger invisible, or get rid of it in some way. And that is one really easy way to start short-circuiting habits that you don't like, or if you're trying to build a new habit, making it really obvious as a way to help you start triggering the cycle so you can start building up that habit towards your new identity. So that's the first part, the cue, the trigger. And now let's move on to the second part, which is what happens as a result of this cue, which is the cravings. Okay, so we've talked about the cue, what gets you started, what triggers your mind to start craving something. So now let's talk about cravings. Cravings are, in my view, really the most important part of this whole thing because it also tells you a lot about yourself. So let's talk about what a craving is. Cravings are what Clear calls the motivational force behind a habit. So when you crave something, you really desire it. You feel it. It's an emotional feeling. And that is really what drives the habit itself. So here are a couple other quotes that Clear uses to really describe cravings. And I think this next quote might be the most important one that I share because I think it will help make clear what we're actually talking about. A lot of times we're just talking about the behavior here, but we're not getting at the sort of deeper psyche portion of this. So let me explain what I'm talking about. So you have a cue, and then it triggers a craving, a desire. But as Clear mentions, he says, quote, "What you crave is not the habit itself, but the change in state it delivers." So I'll say it one more time. Clear writes, "What you crave is not the habit itself, but the change in state that it delivers." So this is really, really important, right? So a lot of times when we have a craving, we think that we want the actual response, the action we take. So I want to eat a candy bar, or, I want to, and I really am driven to, enjoy exercising. But what he's saying is that it's actually not the habit itself. It's not the behavior itself that you're after. It's how you feel, the state it puts you in as a result. The easiest example I can give is really around what a lot of us do after work, which is some form of stress relief or relaxation, right? So, for instance, you might, when you get home, you really want to relax. You want to get out from, you're tired and you're stressed and you're sort of just kind of worn down from a long day's work. And so what do a lot of us do? We look to substances. So you might look to a glass of wine, or you might look to smoke some weed. And the reason is not because you really love actually drinking that glass of wine or taking that hit of marijuana, although, you certainly can enjoy those things. But the reason you do it is because of where it takes you. It's because of the state it puts you in. It changes your state from tired, worn out, irritable, hungry, whatever it is, to relaxed, content, etc. And that's such a subtle but important difference in how you view habits, because habits are trying to put you into a different state of mind as opposed to just getting you to do things mindlessly and meaninglessly. The reason I work out is because obviously I want to be healthy, but I also feel a lot better afterwards. I feel accomplished. I feel lighter. I also, I sort of give myself permission to enjoy more of what I'm eating and other things like that, right? And so cravings, this is why cravings are so powerful, because they speak to what's actually going on, like what we truly desire. And this is also why emotional appeals in general work so much more effectively than appeals to logic and reason. So when you're trying to get people to change their minds about something or persuade them, emotional appeals, getting to those cravings of validation or recognition or being desired or being attractive, those types of things. There are a lot of sort of core underlying cravings that we as human beings have. Those types of appeals always work so much more effectively than logical appeals and rational appeals. It's why people get caught up in things that may not make a lot of sense on the surface, but it's because it's what it's making them feel. It's driving them, and once it becomes a part of their identity, then it's a whole other thing. It's really about who they are and why they even exist. This is one of those things too. It's like when you think back to identity, why people who are vegan, that is their identity, right? It's not just, I'm trying to not eat meat, or it's actually who they are, and that's why they can be so passionate about it, because it's such a critical part of their identity. So again, we're talking about cravings. So you have a cue, a trigger, and it generates a craving. Now, what Clear says, when you want to try to master your cravings, or when you're trying to build or break new habits, build new habits or break existing habits, When you're thinking about the craving part, what you can do is try to make the craving either really attractive if you're trying to build a new habit, or very unattractive if you're trying to break a habit. So let's take some examples. So to build a habit, you want to make the craving really, really attractive. That feeling, that motivation, super attractive. And so what that can mean is you kind of can build a story around what the habit's going to do for you and what's it going to make you feel like. And so what you can do is you can modify the habit to incorporate more things that you really, really are attracted to or you're really enticed by. So I'll use my gym example because I think it's simple enough. So I tell this to everybody, but when I go to the gym, I really only work out on the elliptical machine and the treadmill. And that's just easy. It makes it easy to be consistent with. But what I really got me hooked on it was because I realized that I can watch my favorite shows while I'm on both of those machines. You know, we all have smartphones now that have streaming apps. And once I realized that and stopped trying to do the whole music thing, like music for me doesn't hold my attention well enough during exercising, especially cardio like that. So what I do every day when I go to the gym, I get on the elliptical, it's a 20-minute cycle, and I do my stretches or whatever, get on the elliptical, and as soon as I start, I put on a show or a movie. And it's almost always a show or movie that I either already know I love or I've been trying to see or trying to catch up on, and I watch it. And then, once I reach the end of the cycle and I move over to the treadmill, I put it back on. And so for me, this has made the process of going to the gym really, really attractive, as silly as that might sound. It's because I know when I go over there, it's like, oh, sweet, I get to watch my favorite shows, or I get to catch up on something that I haven't seen before. And that is such a powerful incentive. And we all know that. I mean, a lot of us sit at home at night binge watching stuff because it's enjoyable and it's relaxing. So that's how I've made that habit or this craving really extra attractive. So I crave, being in good shape and feeling good after a workout, but now I also crave watching the shows during the workout. So it's just reinforced the craving and thus the habit that I'm forming. On the flip side, if you're trying to break a habit, you want to make the craving really unattractive. And so one example he gives, which I think is interesting, is around smoking cigarettes specifically. A lot of times smokers will convince themselves that smoking, they do it for social reasons. They also do it as a stress reliever. And so what he found, and some people did some research on this, is that actually smoking is not that social anymore, especially. A lot of times you have to actually leave social groups to go and smoke outside. And so now you're no longer social, actually isolating yourself. They also don't necessarily relieve stress. They actually create anxiety over time for a lot of folks, because eventually you get to the end of that sort of nicotine rush and you start getting anxious and you need another one. And so what some programs do is they actually really hammer this home with folks and say, actually, every time you smoke, you're being antisocial and you're creating stress. And so being able to flip that framing makes the habit itself and that craving that much more unattractive. Another way to do it with smoking, as an example, is, reminding the smoker or yourself, if you're smoking, that you smell like smoke. Right? I know for me, that's a pretty powerful thing. It's like anytime somebody tells me I smell like something, it immediately makes me feel self-conscious about it. And it makes that behavior that much more unattractive. And so same thing here is, if you're a smoker, recognizing that every time you smoke, you're going to smell like smoke. And then you're the person who smells like smoke. That just makes the craving to smoke that much more unattractive. And on top of all that, when we're using cigarettes as an example, we obviously know the health effects are negative also for your health. So to kind of put a bow on the cravings part, so we have the cue that triggers your habit, or triggers your cravings. You're wanting something. The cravings are the motivational force behind your habit. So they're that emotional feeling, that desire for whatever it is you're going after. But ultimately, cravings are not about the habit itself. Cravings are about the change in state that they deliver. So your change in state of mind. And so through that, I like to think about cravings are really the place where you get key insights about yourself. They answer the question of what are you really seeking, which can open up your mind to all kinds of ideas about other options. So for instance, if after work you have wine or weed or something else to relax, then what you really want is to be relaxed. You want to get into a relaxed state of mind. And so if those are habits you'd like to change, what you can go after is try to say to yourself, okay, what are other things, other activities that put me in a relaxed state of mind? Maybe it's listening to a certain type of music. Maybe it's going for a walk. Maybe it's sitting down and talking with your partner, or just sitting outside quietly for 20 minutes. There's plenty of other ways to think about it, but when you start to think about what's the state of mind you're trying to arrive at instead of what's the behavior, the habit here that you're going after, that can help you really break cravings down. So again, cravings are the motivational force behind a habit, and they're really pushing you to get to a change in state of mind versus just craving the habit itself. So you've got a cue, something that triggers you to crave something. So you walk into a dark room, that's your cue. You crave to have light so you can see. You get in your car, the alarm goes off because you don't have your seatbelt on. That's your cue. Your craving is to get the alarm off because it's so freaking annoying, and that causes you to make a response. Your phone vibrates, which is your cue, and your craving is to know what the text message says. So that's really your craving. So now that we've got cue and craving out of the way, let's move on to the action portion of the habit cycle. So something cues you, you've got your craving, and now we're going to move on to response. So that's where actually the actions take place. All right, so we talked about cue and craving. Now let's talk about what actually happens. So you've got the craving, and now you respond. So the response part is probably the easiest of the 4 steps. It's literally just what action you take. So as Clear puts it, quote, the response is the actual habit you perform, which can take the form of a thought or an action. Whether a response occurs depends on how motivated you are and how much friction is associated with the behavior. So using some of our examples, you go into a dark room, you crave to be able to see, and your response, so cue, craving, response, your response is just to find the light switch and flick it, right? Very, very simple example, very basic, and easy, right? So that's why light switches are always by doorways. It makes it easier. So when we're trying to build or break habits, your response, the action, what you can do is if it's a habit you're trying to build, you want to try to make the action, make that response as easy as possible. And if you're trying to break the habit, you want to try to make the response as difficult as possible. So again, I'll use a personal example here. I'm going to go back to my gym example. So I like to go to the gym. I wanted to go more frequently, but I was going to a gym that was, probably a 5-minute drive away or a 10-minute walk away from my place. And at first, my thought was, okay, I like this gym because I'm paying for it. So the financial commitment should be my motivator, right? That's going to push me to really go and get the most out of the gym. I'm sure a lot of you have had that similar feeling. It's like if you invest money, then all of a sudden that's going to make you more committed to the new habit you're trying to form. And if you're like everybody else, you've realized that doesn't always work. Again, because it's not actually taking advantage of how habits work. And so for me, I had been a member of that gym for a long time, but I realized I still wasn't going as often as I wanted to go. Meanwhile, in my apartment complex, there is a small gym. Now, for a long time, I avoided going to the gym in my apartment complex for 2 reasons. One is because I wasn't paying for it, and I didn't think I was trying to commit to my other gym. And 2 was because the gym was smaller here. It doesn't have as much equipment, and it just didn't. It doesn't have the feel of like a professional gym or anything like that. So for a while, I let those things stand in my way. But then I realized, okay, if I'm trying to build a habit of going to the gym more often, I need to make it as easy as possible. Now, which is going to be easier? Getting to the gym that's literally a 60-second walk, it's across the parking lot from my apartment, or making a 5-minute drive or a 10, 15-minute walk to a gym, nearby. Obviously, it's much easier just to be able to walk straight from my apartment to the gym in less than 2 minutes. That seems very, very obvious. And now I also realize it's like I'm someone who just needs to get used to a new place. And so, going into this smaller gym with less equipment, at first I was like, oh, that's kind of a disadvantage. But then I realized I don't use all that equipment anyways, right? I'm just on the elliptical and the treadmill, and I also maybe do free weights every now and then. But whatever. The gym has everything that I need. I've just convinced myself that my financial investment, my $50 a month at this other gym, makes it worth it, which is obviously was not bearing fruit. It was not proving to be correct. And so to build a new habit, I decided to make going to the gym a lot easier on myself. I, cut my membership, and now I go to the gym across my parking lot every single day. And it's that easy. And so when we're thinking about the response, so you've got something that triggers, you have your cue, it triggers a craving, this desire to achieve a new state of mind. And that then leads to a response. So you've got your cue, your craving, your response, and your action. So like your response is the action that you take, right? And so that's really where rubber meets the road. Now, if you're trying to break a habit, you want to make the response, your typical behavior, your typical action, you want to make it a lot harder. And so, the example I used before about scrolling my phone late at night, to make it more difficult on myself to actually physically do that, I put my phone in the other room. Now, could I get up and go get it? Certainly. But what we're doing here, as Clear talks about, is you're creating friction. So if you want to make something more difficult to do, you just have to create more points of friction, make it that much harder to do what you're trying to do. And that's really the key to breaking the response portion of a habit. So let's look at a couple other examples. Let's say that you love snack foods. Let's just use like Cheez-Its or Goldfish as an example. Love both of those for the record. And so does my fiance. We love Cheez-Its. I mean, who doesn't? It's probably one of the top snack foods of all time. Might have to do a whole other mini series on that. But in all seriousness, so we used to have like a box of Cheez-Its in our pantry. And, of course we would buy it and then we'd eat it and last maybe like 2 nights. And so what's a way to, if we want to stop eating Cheez-Its so often, what's a way to make that response, make that action a lot more difficult? Well, the easiest way to make it more difficult is to not buy the Cheez-Its in the first place, right? If I need to drive to the store to get the snack, then I am much less likely to actually do that. If you're trying to drink less wine, or you're trying to smoke less weed, or you're trying to, whatever it is you're trying to do, if you make it really difficult, that will help you go a long way. And so when it's talking about consuming stuff, you're eating or drinking things, the easiest thing to do is just to not have it in your house. That's the most difficult barrier you can put up. And it's honestly the easiest thing that I would recommend. And so again, response is the third part of the cycle. You have cue, craving, response, and then reward is the last piece. So I want to go right into reward because response is pretty straightforward. It's just the action that you're taking. And if you want to build a habit, again, make the response, make that action really easy. If you want to break a habit, make the action really, really difficult. And so you take these actions, these responses, and they lead to rewards. So that's our final piece of the puzzle. So you have a cue, you have a craving, a response, and a reward. So reward is that final stage. It's where you actually satisfy the craving, right? You just took the action, so you just ate the candy bar, or you just worked out, or whatever it is, and now you've reached that new state of mind that has satisfied the craving. And this is how Clear puts it. So Clear says in Atomic Habits, quote, "Rewards are the end goal of every habit. The cue is about noticing the reward. The craving is about wanting the reward. The response is about obtaining the reward. And then we chase rewards because they serve 2 purposes. 1, the reward satisfies us, the craving. And 2, the reward teaches us. So he says the reward teaches us which actions are worth remembering in the future, because our brain is, quote, a reward detector. And so as I alluded to at the top of the episode, every time your brain gets a reward, you reach that final piece of the cycle, and you get that dopamine hit, your brain is again reminded, it's given another example that when you have this behavior, this habit, it results in this reward, in this feeling. And so that's why habits are so powerful. Even if they're things that you find helpful or unhelpful, it doesn't matter. They are really powerful on your brain, because your brain starts to remember that behavior leads to this feeling, and it associates the two. And so what research has found, and this is pretty crazy, eventually the anticipation of the reward, or the craving of the reward, actually provides the same dopamine hit as the reward itself. So let me say that one more time. When you first build a habit, you're trying to get to the reward, right? You have a cue, something that triggers you. You have you have a craving, an emotional desire. You want something. You have a response. You take an action. And then you reach the reward where you satisfy that craving. But it gets to the point where your brain, because it gets so used to a habit, when you first get that cue, that trigger, that craving part of the cycle actually produces the same types of dopamine spikes, the same rushes of reward that the reward itself actually gives you. And so this is why, one of the reasons why drug addiction is so powerful, because you can get to the point where your brain knows what's coming and it seeks it out. And so the craving is as powerful as the actual action and reward itself, because you're anticipating, you know for sure, your brain knows for sure what's going to happen. And this is true of any habit you form. Over time, the anticipation starts to weigh as much as the reward itself. And so if you're trying to build a habit, the way to use rewards in your support of yourself is to make the reward really satisfying, right? And so I'll finish my gym example because it's the top of mind for me. So after I go to the gym, my reward is not only feeling better, but I stack another habit on top of it. So when I get back from the gym, I make a coffee, which I love, and I also eat a protein bar, which I found a protein bar brand. It's called Fit Crunch. It's amazing. I've tried a lot of brands. Most of them are terrible, but this one's actually really good. And so now what I've done is I connected two habits. I've connected the habit of going to the gym with the habit of coming back and eating the protein bar. And the protein bar sort of serves as my reward on top of the feeling I get from the gym. And so it's something I need to do as the gym, and then I follow with something I want, which is the protein bar. And it's also relatively healthy, and it's good to follow up my workout with. And so in that sense, I've started combining the two in order to make the habit that much more satisfying. Now, if you're trying to break a habit, you want to try to make the reward really unsatisfying. So I want to use one quick example that you may not have heard about, but it's really fascinating, and it's around around alcohol addiction or alcoholism. And so most of us, when we think about addiction and alcoholics, you think about AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the 12-step program. You may have heard of it, or you don't necessarily just know the steps, but it's a community-based model with sort of steps to walk you through kind of overcoming the habit. And the success is mixed, but there's another method out there that takes advantage of the way we form habits. And that method is called the Sinclair method. And it's actually popularized, I believe, in Europe. I heard about it because my fiance works in psychiatry as a nurse practitioner, and she works with people with addiction. She also works with people with all kinds of other challenges like ADHD or depression. And so she turned me on to this, and we researched it. Sinclair method is fascinating because it's a different way to help alcoholics remove the craving for alcohol. And so what it does is, the Sinclair method is you take this drug, it's called naltrexone. you take it an hour before you plan to have alcohol, and then what happens is it basically disables the receptors, the dopamine receptors, for the person taking it. And so you take this naltrexone, and then an hour later when it's kicked in, you can drink. And what happens for the alcoholic or the person drinking, it really can happen to anybody who's using it, is when they drink, they no longer experience the reward, the euphoria that comes from drinking. It's because naltrexone blocks those receptors. And so what's happening when we think about our habit cycle here, you have your cue, craving, response, reward. So a drinker, maybe they get home, they have the cue to drink, that craving, they want that buzz, that feeling of being drunk. Their response is to drink, and then the reward is actually the euphoria of being drunk or having a buzz, right? Naltrexone, what it does is it stops that reward from happening, or it makes the act of drinking very unsatisfying. It just, apparently it makes you groggy, and it doesn't really, you don't feel any of the positive effects of being drunk, or I should say positive feelings of being drunk. And so over time, the brain actually reshapes and reforms its neural connections, and it no longer associates drinking with euphoria. And so while this is not the dominant method for alcohol addiction, it is very, very effective. And it's because it makes use of how our brains work with habits. Again, this is called the Sinclair method. I'll try to put a link to it in the show notes just if you're curious. But I think it's such a cool and interesting illustration of how powerful our brains are and how this habit stuff really does work. So cue, craving, response, reward. If you can short circuit that reward and make it really unsatisfying, then it's going to make the habit itself a lot less likely to occur over and over again, because you're not actually going to achieve any sort of great ending for yourself. You're not going to get a reward. It might be really, really difficult or unsatisfying, I should say. So those are the 4 steps: cue, craving, response, reward. And I just want to close out with a quick strategy that you can use to get started with this, and a free resource. And then we'll wrap it up. Episode 2 of this Building and Breaking Habits multi-part series. Okay, so real quick to finish up, here's what you can do if you want to get started on, building or breaking habits now. Now that you know how a habit works, you have a cue, a trigger, you have a craving that results, a feeling of wanting something, a response, the action that you take, and then ultimately the reward. The first, what you should not do, what is not a winning strategy, is hating yourself. Hating yourself is not a strategy. Neither is critiquing yourself, yelling at yourself, making fun of yourself, or belittling yourself. Remember that. Please, please remember that. A lot of times what we do is we just spend so much time in our heads being like, oh, you piece of shit, you can't do this, you're not building this habit, it's not working because you're a loser, even if it works for everybody else. None of that stuff works, and it's not helpful. And so cut that crap out as best you can. Because those are habits too. Negative thought patterns are habits. Those are patterns. That's why we call them that. And so that's just my little soapbox. You're already taking really proactive steps. So you've already given yourself evidence that you listened to this episode and you are making changes towards whatever person you're trying to become. So props to you. Kudos. You're in the right place. We are people here who are really about growth and becoming the different versions of ourselves that we really want to experience and achieve things with. And so here's my suggestion. Don't even worry about forming new habits yet. What I actually advise clients to do, and I help them with, and I've created a very simple tool, is to start by doing a habit audit. And that's pretty straightforward. It's just going through your day-to-day and starting to recognize and document what habits you already have, big and small, helpful or unhelpful. And so I've actually created a very simple template. It's a Google sheet that you can download and make a copy of for yourself. I'll put it in the show notes, and it's also going to be up on my website, ianscottcohen.com. And with this template, you can document your habits. I've got a few examples in there. and it helps you break it down into the 4 parts of the habit: the cue, craving, response, and reward, whether you find the habit helpful or unhelpful. And then, it prompts you to kind of think about some ideas of how to, whether you want to keep the habit or break it. That's where I would suggest starting. We're going to do one more episode on habits around motivation, and that's where we can get into forming new habits or breaking old ones. But first, it's about awareness. It's being aware of what you're actually doing. Because honestly, you probably know a few habits off the top of your head that you have, but you probably forget a lot of other ones. And most of them are probably pretty positive. Like brushing your teeth every day. Hopefully that's something that you do, but that is a positive, it's a good habit for your health that a lot of us do and we take for granted. Like, we don't give ourselves credit for that because it's a small thing, and at this point it's so automatic that it doesn't even register in our minds. But that is a habit as well. Turning lights on in a room is a habit as well. That's what I would call a neutral habit. It doesn't really have a positive or negative impact on who we're trying to be, unless maybe you're trying to not use electricity or something. But do a habit audit, so a reflection on what habits you already have, and visit my website or look at the show notes for the link, and you can make a copy of the spreadsheet that I have. It's really easy to fill out, and it'll help you just start to break down what habits you have. And from there, you can tune into the final episode of the mini-series where we'll actually get into how to motivate yourself and the keys behind motivation, and that'll help you really get going into forming this new identity and becoming that version of yourself that you keep imagining, but maybe you feel like you're falling short of right now. So I'll leave you there, and I appreciate you putting the time in to really listen to this and focus on your own growth. You're in the right place. You're doing the right thing. And if nobody else is out there, I'm your champion, and I love that you're here listening to this. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Hey friends, before you go, I want to tell you about one more free coaching resource called The Gas Up. It is my weekly coaching email I send out every Sunday evening to help you get engaged and ready for the week ahead. You can sign up now using the link in the show notes, or follow me on Instagram at Ian Scott Cohen to find the link in my bio. And if you forget, you can always find all this information and more about my coaching programs at www.ianscottcohen.com. Thanks again for tuning in to the Growth Coach podcast, and we'll see you next time.